The Last Day of Light, monologue style. Mariupol, Wednesday, February 23, 2022. Wednesday smelled of cinnamon. That scent, warm and comforting, remained the last bright memory of the former life, of the part of it that was sunlit and knew no fear. It was an ordinary day in the apartment on Metallurhiv Avenue, though above the city the sky hung low and heavy, as if filled with unspoken anticipation. Anna, tired but focused, was getting ready for work. She needed to finalize a trip voucher to the Carpathians for an elderly couple. How strange to remember now that the main worries were payment deadlines and train schedules. She thought about what those people had managed to do. They managed to catch their last peaceful sunset on a mountain. Her son, 10-year-old Misha, sat at the table, trying to reconcile his school textbook with the remnants of a poppy seed bun. His childlike curiosity was beginning to mix with that vague anxiety that had been hovering in the air like sea fog for several weeks. Anna's old father, Petro Semenovich, was wrapped in a blanket in an armchair by the window. Hissing, anxious voices filled with reports and statements drifted from his receiver, which looked like an antique box. News had become the sole backdrop of life, eclipsing the sound of the sea and the hum of the factories. She felt his worry, his silent plea to stay home. It's all just fear-mongering, she told herself, gathering her bag, trying to convince him and herself. But the thought of the old sturdy basement, once built for storing pickles and not for protection against rockets, still offered a faint, fragile comfort. When she leaned down to her son to say goodbye, he looked up at her, his eyes full of almost adult fear. He asked about the war. Anna knelt down. She needed to give him a rule, a ritual that could substitute for security. She made him repeat, "Grab your backpack, take Grandpa, and we run to the basement." And, most importantly, their long-standing, almost sacred phrase, "And we'll come back when we see the sea again." That kiss on his head was a farewell she didn't know she was making. A farewell to a warm, dry home, to the certainty of tomorrow. She stepped into the stairwell, smelling of dust. And the moment the door closed behind her, she thought she heard something very distant, yet incredibly heavy, as if the world far away had tipped over a huge cast-iron cauldron. She hurried. None of them knew that the smell of cinnamon would soon be replaced by the smell of burning and damp, and the light of the bulb by the dim glow of a candle. The peaceful light had definitively gone, leaving only a shadow on the doorstep. The morning of the 24th, the first descent. The real darkness did not come with the night. The real darkness came at dawn, when the world should have woken up, but instead began to crumble. Anna had returned home late, exhausted by a day spent in futile conversations. Clients canceled the Carpathians. Everyone talked only about rumors, about the vague threat on the borders. She fell asleep feeling as if she were sleeping on thin ice. She woke up to a sound that forever split her life into before and after. It wasn't just thunder. It was a crackle, a tear, metal ripping through the air somewhere far away, but with such force that the window glass shuddered and wailed pitifully, as if alive. It was followed by an impact, not a wave, but a physical jolt, palpable in the chest. Petro Semenovich was already standing in the hallway. He hadn't been asleep. His old eyes, which had seen life and the Soviet era, now looked with a clear, terrible comprehension. Not a word was said. Words were superfluous. Anna grabbed Misha. Her son, woken by that inhuman sound, did not scream or cry. He looked like a small fawn frozen in the middle of a field. He only tightly clutched his small pre-packed backpack to his chest. Toys, a couple of books, a spare sweater. They moved as if in a dream, like slow motion. The house was still standing, but it was no longer a fortress. It was a trap about to snap shut. With trembling hands, Petro Semenovich opened the door of the old, dusty closet in the hallway, which concealed the entrance to the basement. The basement was a narrow, concrete burrow leading down into the cold and damp. They descended first, catching the smell of rotting potatoes and moldy jars. Neighbors began to descend behind them, frightened, with pale faces, burdened with pillows, cats, and anxious suitcases. Old Nina Pavlovna holding an icon and for some reason a pot of violets. A young couple who lived on the 10th floor with an infant wrapped in a brightly colored blanket. A grandfather who wouldn't part with his cane and a bottle of water. In that moment, there were no floors, no apartments, no statuses. There were only people, hastily fleeing noise toward a silence that they naively hoped the basement would provide. It was dark underground, very dark. Flashes of light from outside penetrated through the narrow opening, highlighting faces coated in a layer of years of basement dust. Breathing was heavy, the air saturated with the history of that house. Anna found a small dry corner away from the entrance. She laid Petro Semenovich's old blanket on the concrete floor. Misha pressed against her, and she could feel his small heart beating fiercely. The sounds above grew louder. They turned into a metallic echo that the basement, like a huge concrete bowl, amplified. Scraping, explosions, trembling. It felt as if the house itself was groaning and trying to shake itself off like a dog shaking off water. The neighbors sat silently, staring at the faint light coming from the single old flashlight that Anna had brought with her. That flashlight, with its nearly dead battery, became their first shared sun in the new underground world. Anna looked at the faces around her. These people, whom she had cursorily greeted in the elevator for years, were now her only tribe, her only protection. She noticed that Misha, despite the horror, couldn't take his eyes on the infant. The infant, wrapped in a bright, peaceful blanket, slept, unaware that his first morning had been spent in a concrete tomb. Petro Semenovich, leaning against the wall, did not speak, but his hand slowly stroked Anna's hair. He wasn't looking for words of comfort, because none existed. In that damp, cold silence, they began the countdown of a new time. It was day 1, and it felt like eternity. The alphabet of silence. The days, merged with nights, acquired a new, shaky rhythm. Time, which used to be measured by work hours and school bells, was now fractured by the number of shell impacts and the volume of remaining water. On the second basement day, which felt like the 10th, Anna understood. Survival wasn't just about food, but about new rules. They had to create their own unwritten constitution of this small concrete state. The first law was the rule of sound. War thundered above, but here below, the alphabet of silence must reign. Any loud, unexpected noise in the basement could trigger panic. Petro Semenovich, thanks to his natural sternness and the respect he commanded, became the unspoken guardian of this silence. He sat, lips pressed tight, watching as Misha, her son, tried to play with an old coiled rope, careful not to strike it against the concrete. The hardest part was learning to distinguish the sounds of war. This lesson was bloody and fast. On the third day, when one of the neighbors tried to jump up in a panic, Anna heard one of the men, A silent taxi driver from the 5th floor whisper, "Don't get up. That's a grad, flying far away. If it were a mortar, we wouldn't have heard it already." And it was true. The sound passed them by. Thus, they unwillingly became experts. The sound of a high whistle that didn't fade meant close but missed artillery. A low rumbling pass, like a train in a tunnel, meant a tank or heavy equipment. But the most terrifying sound, the sound that made everyone press against the floor and pray, was the sudden, intensifying shriek, followed by a complete silence before the impact. That meant death was flying directly toward them. Their existence was wild, primal. Anna's dim flashlight, whose battery conservation became a sacred ritual, provided only a small circle of yellow light. They used it for only an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. All other time passed in a soft, viscous darkness, where sight atrophied and hearing, conversely, sharpened to the limit. Anna watched the others. Nina Pavlovna, holding the violet, tried every morning to find light for her flower, bringing it close to the faint spot barely penetrating from the crack. The young mother, Katya, held her infant, who with a strange irony seemed the calmest creature in this hell. He slept and ate, unaware of the war, and his quiet, snuffling inhale and exhale became balm for everyone, proof that life continues. The psychological tension mounted. People sat so close they could smell each other's unwashed bodies, and fear, but speaking of fear, was avoided. Instead, they talked about food, about how good it would be to eat fresh borscht, about the crunchy crust of a baguette, about the smell of coffee, which now seemed like a memory of a past civilization. Petro Semenovich, who had been a design engineer before the war, found a task for himself. He began inspecting the basement walls. He tapped the concrete, checked the ceiling slabs, muttering technical specifications under his breath. It didn't provide them with protection, but it gave the illusion of control over the situation, and that was just as vital as food. Anna, clutching Misha, saw her son changing. He no longer asked about the sea. Now he quietly ran his finger along the damp concrete wall, making notches, tiny vertical lines. These marks, like a rough stitch, became their first calendar. Each line meant a day that had been lived through, a day that had been stolen from the war. She knew if they survived these walls, they would never forget this alphabet of silence. It would sound louder than any noise in their memory, reminding them of how the human heart learned to be small, patient, and very, very quiet. The search for water. Water became the first true executioner. At first, everyone hoped the supply of bottled water brought by the neighbors would last until tomorrow when everything would end. But tomorrow never came, and by the 5th day in the cellar, it was obvious that their civilization was shrinking to 1 liter per 5 people per day. Thirst was not just a physical sensation. It was a constant, drilling reminder that they were completely cut off from the world. It made movements sluggish and thoughts muddy. Misha, who in peacetime drank glass after glass, now looked at his mother with eyes full of guilt when he asked for an extra sip. Anna felt her maternal heart contract with helplessness. The decision was not just dangerous, it was suicidal. The water supply, like the electricity, had died in the first days. The only known source in the area was an old street pump 3 blocks from the house, near the intersection. Going there meant stepping out from the protection of the concrete, stepping directly into the sights of an invisible but all-consuming threat. The first time, Petro Semenovich volunteered. Anna tried to protest, but her father was adamant. His composure, his steely will that had always characterized the engineer, suddenly became his sharpest weapon. He said quietly but firmly, "I'm going. I'm old.
My legs are slow, but I know how one must move, and I need to be here alive, but with water." He took 2 large plastic buckets he used for winter pickles and the oldest, quietest backpack. Before leaving, he put on the most inconspicuous clothes and stood by the stairs listening. He was waiting for the music, a pause between the shelling that lasted no longer than a minute. Anna watched his disappearance, feeling everything inside her that was still alive freeze. Misha sat pressed against her and held his breath. All the cellar inhabitants, usually submerged in their thoughts, now listened intently to the sounds outside. Every minute stretched like an hour. The noise overhead was unbearable, but the silence was more terrifying. In the silence, it seemed that the danger was creeping up, that it had already seen their father. After 40 long minutes, they heard a barely audible but painfully familiar scrape. It was the buckets being dragged across the concrete. Petro Semenovich had returned. His face was gray with dust and horror, and his movements were disjointed, as if he were about to collapse. He didn't speak. He just put the buckets on the floor. The water inside was cloudy, smelling of bleach and life, and it looked like the most precious treasure on earth. The dim light of the flashlight reflected in it, and the sight was more beautiful than any diamond. Petro Semenovich did not recount what he had seen, but from the way he gripped his blanket with trembling hands and buried his face in the corner, Anna understood the world above was murdered. He had seen ruins. He had seen what no one should see. After that incident, an unspoken rota was established in the cellar. The trip for water turned into a daily ritual, walking a fine line between necessity and death. They went in pairs, covering each other. Everyone who returned with full buckets automatically became a hero. Anna, to her dread, also had to go. It was her 11th day in the cellar. She stood by the entrance, holding an empty bucket and feeling the weight of fear. Before stepping out, she turned to Misha. He didn't cry, didn't beg. He just nodded, reminding her of the rule: "We'll come back when we see the sea again." She ascended. The air was acrid, the sky low and black with smoke, and the moment her foot touched the icy asphalt, she heard a distant but familiar squistle. Time stopped, and she ran, because the water she went out for was more important than her fear. She ran to bring life back to her concrete world. The warmth of one blanket. After the sorties for water, which took a piece of the soul each time, came the time for psychological respite. This happened late in the evening, when Anna's flashlight had long gone out, and the sounds of war subsided for a time, as if tired. In the absolute darkness, under the cover of Petro Semenovich's old prickly blanket, which now served as Misha's quilt, stories were born. These stories were their only currency, the only way to preserve the remnants of light. They spoke softly, almost whispering, so as not to violate the sanctity of the cellar's silence. The themes were always the same: peaceful life, food, the sea. Nina Pavlovna, holding her violet, talked about her garden near Mariupol. She didn't talk about flowers. She talked about the explosion of scent after the rain, about how one must correctly tie up tomatoes so they don't touch the ground, about how her husband, deceased, always laughed when she harvested. Her words, like gentle aromas, penetrated the stale cellar air, painting pictures in the darkness that were impossible to destroy. The taxi driver from the 5th floor, Igor, shared memories of his job. He spoke not of roads and fares, but of people, of a bride who forgot her passport, of a veteran who gave him an old coin for luck. His voice, low and hoarse, reminded them that the world above was full of small but important human connections that the war could not sever. Anna, holding Misha, who often fell asleep to these quiet, monotonous tales, shared her own memories. She talked about the sea. It was her favorite topic. She described it not as water, but as a color that changes from azure to deep blue, as the feeling of fine sand between her toes, as the salty taste on her lips after swimming. She spoke about it in such detail that the people around her, closing their eyes, could almost feel the breeze, not the smell of dampness. These stories were not just narratives, they were acts of resistance. As long as they could vividly imagine the smell of cinnamon or the sound of the waves, the war could not definitively defeat their consciousness. It was like a rite. Everyone shared their warmest, brightest memory to place that piece of warmth into the shared, collective blanket. Misha, her little calendar, listened to the stories with special attention. One night, when everyone fell silent and only a dull, distant thump sounded somewhere above, he quietly whispered, without opening his eyes, "Mom, do you remember when Grandpa Petya gave me that telescope and we looked at the stars? I thought then that stars were holes in the sky through which you could see the light that was beyond the sky." His words, spoken in the absolute darkness of the cellar, sounded like a small revelation. Light. They had forgotten about it, replacing it with a dim flashlight. But Misha reminded them that light exists, even if it is behind multiple layers of concrete and a broken sky. That night, Anna felt that the blanket she shared with her son grew warmer. It was not physical heat, but the warmth of community, the warmth of collective memory they were weaving like fine threads. They were trapped, immobilized, stripped of everything, but they preserved the inner fire, the ability to dream and remember. This fire would not be enough to warm the concrete walls, but it was enough to warm human hearts. When the 12th day arrived and the old metal cellar doors scraped open again, letting in the smell of smoke, they knew that their shelter was not just concrete. It was a safe for their memories, for their humanity. The missing coffee. Time in the cellar ceased to be linear. It became viscous, sluggish, as if they had fallen into a well where every day was indistinguishable from the last, and only Misha's scratch marks on the wall reminded them of life's flow. After 2 weeks, when the supply of all necessities approached a critical point, small poisonous conflicts replaced quiet stoicism. The deficit of food and water was obvious, but the most painful was the disappearance of small comforts. Coffee. Anna had a small tin with the last grains of ground coffee, which she guarded like the apple of her eye. It was not just a drink, it was a ritual, a connection to the former, organized life. Its smell, even dry, was a reminder of comfort. On the 16th day, when Anna reached for the tin, she found it lighter. She opened it, and her heart clenched with a resentment stronger than physical hunger. Someone had taken a handful. Not much, but enough to break the sacred rule of the cellar, not to take what belongs to others. For the first time since the nightmare began, the silence in the cellar was not one of horror, but one of suspicion. No one spoke. Anna couldn't ask, because the question would destroy the fragile truce between the neighbors. War had taken their homes, and the theft of coffee could take their humanity. She looked at the faces around her. Igor, the taxi driver, sat staring blankly at the wall. Nina Pavlovna was soothing the violet as if noticing nothing. Everyone avoided eye contact. Anna understood. The conflict was inevitable, and it would be silent. Instead of shouting, she did something unexpected. The next morning, during the short hour of flashlight light, she quietly, wordlessly, divided the remaining coffee grains. She took a clean piece of fabric, separated the coffee into small portions, and silently placed each one on its territory. It was an invitation to honesty. The act had an effect. An hour later, as Anna sat hugging Misha, Petro Semenovich approached her. He did not speak, but he held a small crumpled packet in his hand. Inside were 2 grains of sugar. He placed them next to her portion of coffee and returned to his spot. It was an act of atonement for all who might have taken, and an act of restoring justice. The incident with the coffee became a turning point. It taught them that the greatest danger lay not in the shells overhead, but in the decomposition of the spirit below. After that conflict, they became more attentive to each other. People began to share voluntarily. Someone gave away their last dry biscuit, someone a piece of their old but warm shawl. Anna understood that in the cellar where there were no laws and no police, the only regulator was mutual respect. They learned to see another's pain not as their own weakness, but as a mirror of their own. Evenings ceased to be only a time for lyrical recollections. Now they included business advice, how best to divide the ration, who would go for water, and how to patch a hole in an old blanket. Their collective blanket became not only a repository of memory, but also a social contract. They survived 3 more days, feeding on these crumbs and this fragile, restored faith in one another. But Anna knew that the real trials were only beginning. When coffee disappears, patience disappears next. The drawing on the damp wall. When the world shrinks to the size of a single cellar and time loses its meaning, the child's mind finds its own unique way of resisting chaos. For Misha, whose curiosity was suppressed by horror, that way was found on the damp concrete wall. Boredom and fear, mixing together, created an unbearable tension. He stopped playing with his rope. The toys he had so carefully packed in his backpack now seemed ridiculous and out of place. His eyes, once full of light, became heavy and adult. He was looking for an outlet. First, there were the hash marks, their uneven, hasty calendar. But on the 23rd day, Misha began to draw. He had neither paper nor pencils. Instead, he used a piece of charcoal found by Petro Semenovich among the debris, and a moist finger with which he could erase and correct his grim masterpieces on the porous wall. The concrete wall became his personal diary. The first drawings were simple and frightening. Large, square houses without windows, which had no roof, but had long, thin legs as if they were trying to run away. Then came black clouds from which sticks, resembling nails, were falling. This was his vision of war. Houses run away, and sharp, prickly things fly from the sky. Anna watched him from her corner. She did not intervene. She knew he needed to speak this without words. She felt that his drawings reflected not only his fear, but the general mood of the entire cellar. These drawings were the truth that adults were trying to hide behind quiet whispers and discussions about the weather. Gradually, the drawings began to change. When he first heard Nina Pavlovna's story about the garden, flowers appeared on the wall. They were black, drawn with charcoal, but their petals were delicate and thin, and their roots went deep into the earth, the cellar floor. This was the first manifestation of hope on the wall. And when he remembered the sea, he drew waves. They looked like wide, soft lines. He erased them, then drew them again. The sea was the only element that was never destroyed in his drawings. His favorite subject became his family. He drew himself, Anna, and Petro Semenovich as small figures holding hands tightly. All of them were drawn inside a large, very thick circle, which clearly symbolized their concrete refuge. Outside the circle were always shadows, and inside, only them, pressed close together. These drawings became the unspoken gallery of the cellar. At night, when the flashlight briefly lit up, the other inhabitants slowly approached the wall. They said nothing, but they looked at Misha's work long and intently. In these childish, angular lines, they saw their own pain and their shared need for salvation. One of his last drawings in that period was particularly telling. He drew their cellar. On the roof of the cellar, he drew a tiny, barely visible sun, but it was not in the sky. It was on the roof, as if the sun was meant to shine not from the outside, but from the inside. Misha, leaning against the wall, quietly told Anna, "Mama, when we get out, I'll take this piece of charcoal with me, so I won't forget that we weren't just hiding here, we were building." He spoke of the drawings as construction, as creating something important, and Anna understood, as long as he drew these flowers and these waves on the damp concrete, he was preserving himself and perhaps all of them. He was their artist, their chronicler, and their smallest but most resilient keeper of the light. The alien voice on the air. On the 35th day, when the cellar walls felt no longer like protection, but like a tombstone, the word arrived. Communication with the outside world had been broken long ago. Mobile phones had long become useless burdens, their batteries dead, and cell towers turned into rubble. Their world was limited to the silence of concrete and the rumble above. But Petro Semyonovich, the old engineer, remembered primitive methods. He pulled an old pocket-sized battery-powered receiver from his kit bag, which he had kept for fishing. He hadn't turned it on before, fearing that the sound might attract attention or worse, cause false hope. But when Misha finished his latest drawing and the collective water supply dropped to a critical level, Petro Semyonovich decided to risk it. He replaced the dead battery with the last sealed one he had saved since peacetime. He went to the farthest corner of the cellar and quietly, almost intimately, turned the tuning wheel. The first thing the inhabitants heard was only hissing, hopeless, white noise, the sound of a universe that had forgotten them. He twisted the knob, catching the weakest waves, and suddenly, through the veil of static, a voice broke through. It was an alien voice, distant and hoarse, but alive. At first, it was just music, an old, quiet Ukrainian song, like a lullaby. The music was so unnatural for this concrete world that people froze. No one moved, afraid that a breath might scare away this miracle. Then the voice of an announcer came on. He spoke quickly, disjointedly, but his words carried information, summaries, names of cities, last names. He spoke of resistance, of aid, of people waiting. Every word was a gulp of oxygen. Anna sat, hand pressed to her mouth. Her heart pounded, echoing dully in the damp air. She learned that Zaporizhia was holding. She learned that Kyiv had not fallen. These were not just facts, they were pillars of light in the surrounding darkness. But the joy was mixed with bitter anxiety. The announcer mentioned their city. He said that communication was lost, the situation was critical, and heavy fighting was taking place in the port. This was confirmation of their worst fears. Their Mariupol, their home, was the epicenter of the pain, and they were underground, like roots that still held on. The biggest blow came when the announcer relayed a message. It is reported that volunteers are preparing to organize corridors from some districts, and then the signal cut off. The screech of static filled the cellar, abruptly severing the thread of hope. Petro Semyonovich, exhausted but with burning eyes, tried to tune in again, futilely. The battery had apparently given its last strength. A deep, heavy silence settled in the cellar. It was worse than before, because now they knew. They were not just lost, they were surrounded. But they also knew that they were being waited for. Igor, the taxi driver, broke the silence for the first time since the war began. Corridors, They are preparing. We are not alone." Anna looked at her father. Petro Semyonovich showed no emotion, but his back was straighter. The alien voice, even if cut short, brought them a purpose. Now they knew that their cellar was not the end of the road, but merely an intermediate stop. They needed to hold on to reach this invisible corridor. They switched to a new economy regime. Every spoon of groats, every sip of water now became fuel for future movement. The receiver lay on the old mat like a sacred artifact. It no longer made sounds, but it became a symbol, proof that there was still a world outside, waiting for their return.
The coming of winter in March. As the war dragged on, nature seemed determined to finish off those who still held on. On the 42nd day, in mid-March, an anomalous cold snap occurred. Underground, where the temperature usually remains constant, it became not just cold, but piercingly cold. The damp concrete turned to ice, and the humidity that had previously been merely unpleasant now began to freeze the heat out of their bones. This was a new, unbearable trial. Rockets and shells threatened quick death. The cold threatened a slow fading. It was a silent, insidious enemy. Children began to cough. Elderly Petro Semyonovich, whose blood could no longer warm his old joints, was trembling despite all the blankets given to him. The struggle for warmth became the main priority. All their meager resources, which had previously been divided between food and water, were now directed towards salvation from the cold. They pushed all their bedding, all their blankets and plaids into one large, tight circle in the center of the cellar. It was a forced, instinctive measure. Their bodies, pressed against each other, had to become a collective source of heat. Anna, clutching Misha, saw how their community transformed. The people who had almost quarreled over a handful of coffee 2 weeks ago were now breathing in unison. They slept like animals in a burrow, intertwining their arms and legs to close all gaps. His forced closeness was awkward, but it was saving. Petro Semyonovich and Igor, the taxi driver, took on the most dangerous job: wood procurement. During short lulls in the shelling, they went up to dismantle the wreckage of neighbors' sheds or broken wooden elements. Every piece of wood was paid for with a risk to life. In the corner of the cellar, they constructed a primitive, improvised hearth, a few bricks found among the cellar debris, and a piece of old metal for ventilation. The smoke, which could betray them, was a problem, but the heat was more important. When they first lit the fire, it was the greatest miracle since the war began. A tiny orange tongue of flame, barely sustained by the wood chips, cast dancing shadows on the damp concrete walls. It did not give off much heat, but it gave light and hope. People held out their hands to it as if to a deity. Anna, sitting by the fire, watched as the flame brought faces to life. The shadows receded, and she saw in the eyes of her neighbors not only weariness, but determination. In that moment, watching the dance of fire and shadows, she understood that people are not just bodies that need food and water. They need ritual. They need a focal point. The fire became their new center. They heated water for herbal tea, which Nina Pavlovna had miraculously found. They dried clothes by it, and, most importantly, they started talking again. But no longer about the past. They started talking about the future, about what they would do after the victory, when they saw the sea again. The fire burned. Misha, wrapped in a blanket, watched the fire, and in his eyes, this ancient primal warmth was reflected. He quietly took a piece of charcoal and, for the first time, drew not houses on his gallery, but a bright, burning flame, a symbol of life that refused to surrender to the cold, the war, and despair. They survived winter in March because they learned to share not only food, but the last warmth of their bodies and souls. The prayer on the old crate. After overcoming the cold crisis, a period of fragile equilibrium set in. Bodies grew accustomed to hunger and cold. The psyche adapted to the constant roar, but the spirit demanded a different kind of nourishment. They needed not only to survive, but to preserve what made them human. On the 51st day, the supply of dry crackers that Katya had been carefully saving for her infant suddenly ran out. She was desperate. The baby was crying not from pain, but from hunger. And that cry, thin and persistent, pierced the cellar silence sharper than any shell. It was the pure, unadulterated sound of helplessness. Anna had the last can of fish preserves, which she had been keeping for Petro Simonovich, fearing his old heart would not withstand constant starvation. This can was her personal, untouchable reserve, her final line of defense. Anna looked at Katya, whose eyes were full of tears and powerlessness, and at the infant. Weeping was useless. She slowly, almost ritually, took out the can. She did not open it immediately. She walked over to the old wooden crate that served as their table and placed the preserves on it. "This is for the baby," she said quietly. It was her first dialogue not with her family, but with the neighbors, yet it sounded like a verdict. But then, something happened that would forever leave a mark on their collective memory. Nina Pavlovna, who sat clutching an icon and her violet, suddenly raised her hand. She was not a wealthy woman, and everyone knew her food supply was the scarcest. "Wait, daughter," she said to Anna. "First, we will pray, not just for the food, for salvation." She placed her icon on the crate next to the can. It was an old, darkened icon, with the face of a saint who looked tired and wise. Nina Pavlovna began to read a prayer, not loud, but filled with such force that it seemed her voice pierced through the thickness of the concrete. She prayed not for victory, but for mercy, for strength of spirit, and for them to preserve their humanity. When she finished, Igor, the taxi driver, who was silent and stern, took a small, very old chocolate bar wrapped in crumpled foil from his backpack. He had kept it, likely from peacetime, as a talisman. He placed it next to the preserves. Then Petro Simonovich, the old engineer, handed Anna his lie. The lie. It was not a truth he spoke. The lie. It was a piece of an old wooden handle that he had carved and sanded until it resembled a spoon. In that moment, Anna understood. It was not about the preserves. It was about sacrifice. Everyone who gave something was not just sharing resources, he was sharing hope and faith. Anna opened the can. The smell of fish was overwhelming. They did not eat it all. They divided it into tiny portions. Katya received the main share for the baby, but even the tiny piece that each person received was imbued not only with salt, but with shared love. This crate, with the icon, the can, and the lie, became their altar. It reminded them that they were not just a group of refugees, they were a community, bound not by blood, but by shared suffering and voluntary mercy. The loudest day. On the 57th day, when the cellar inhabitants had almost become accustomed to the sounds of war, the loudest day arrived. It was the day that erased the line between protection and death, casting doubt on the entire reliability of their concrete refuge. Usually the roar was distant or predictable, but that morning it became personal. It came with an inhuman, piercing wail that started high in the sky and dropped rapidly down. The cellar filled with a sound like metal being ripped to shreds. Igor, who had become their chief listener, only had time to gasp, "Get down! Close!"
This was followed by a strike that was not just a sound, but a physical shockwave across the entire planet. The house shuddered like a wounded animal. The concrete cellar walls, which had seemed so thick and immovable, danced. The ceiling made a terrible grinding sound. Dust rained down from above, not just dust, but cement grip that clogged the mouth and nose, smelling of lime and fear. Everyone pressed themselves to the floor. Anna covered Misha with her body, feeling his small frame shaking in her arms. Petro Semenovich, for the first time in all this time, lost his composure. His old stiff blanket slipped from his shoulder. After the main impact came a second, even more terrifying sound, the sound of destruction. The walls and ceilings above them seemed to have given way. There was a crash of falling beams and the crackle of breaking wood that covered the entrance. The cellar became intolerably quiet and dark. The flashlight was somewhere far away, and the crack through which daylight had penetrated was blocked. They were in complete, tangible darkness, and this darkness smelled of damp earth and fresh char. Panic could have torn them apart. Someone whimpered. Someone began to choke on the cement dust. Anna felt Misha wasn't moving. "Misha, are you here?" she whispered, and her own voice sounded alien and hoarse. "I am here," she replied barely audibly. Then Petro Semenovich, who looked crushed moments ago, found his strength. His low and calm voice sounded like an anchor in a raging sea. "Quiet," he said. "Breathe slowly. The house is standing. We are alive." He began to move slowly, feeling the walls with his hands. Soon he found the flashlight. When he turned it on, the dim beam snatched a scene from the darkness. The entrance to the cellar was almost completely blocked. Debris hung from above, and a thin but long crack appeared in the concrete ceiling above them, which seemed to have withstood everything. The crack was not only in the concrete, it was in their certainty. It vividly showed them their refuge was not eternal. It could collapse at any moment. Igor and Petro Semenovich began frantically but quietly to clear the rubble. They worked without speaking, their movements quick and precise. The others sat like statues, watching their silhouettes in the flashlight beam. On that day, they realized the most terrifying truth. Their suffering was invisible. No one would know if the house collapsed. Their salvation depended entirely on themselves and on the strength of that old worn reinforcement that Petro Semenovich had so carefully checked in the early days. When the rubble was partially cleared and a faint light again penetrated through the crack, they saw the outside world. It looked like a post-apocalyptic landscape, dust, debris, and a heavy gray sky that would never be blue again. But they survived. This day, the loudest day, became the final test of their shared will. If they survived this, they must endure everything else. The dream of the sea. On the 59th day, after the loudest day, the cellar sank into a state of heavy lethargy. All strength had been spent on clearing the rubble and overcoming the shock. The tension left only a quiet, devastating fatigue in the people. Anna lay clinging to Misha and couldn't sleep. She felt that the roar hadn't gone away. It had simply moved inside her head. She closed her eyes, trying to find salvation in the familiar ritual, memories of peaceful Mariupol. She wanted to remember the cinnamon and the laughter, but her consciousness, exhausted by fear, threw up only vivid, salty images. She remembered the sea, not the dull gray sea she had imagined during the first stories, but the living summer sea of Azov. In her dream, she felt the heat of the sun on her shoulders. She saw the bright, almost white sand on the beach, leading to water that was warm as fresh milk. She heard the laughter of Misha, who was then about 7 years old, as he ran covered in spray from the incoming wave. The brightest part was the feeling of salt. She felt its taste on her lips, its smell mixed with the scent of seaweed and shells. The sea was a contrast to everything around her. It was free, immense, clean. In the cellar, the air was heavy and damp. On the shore, it was light and salty. In her dream, Mariupol was alive. Trams full of people with preoccupied but peaceful faces drove along Metallurgiv Avenue. Somewhere far away at Azovstal, there was the familiar hum of work, not explosions. It was a city that knew who it was: port, steel, sun, recreation. She saw herself, her former self, a woman who worried about deadlines and what to wear, a woman who didn't know what a grad or a mortar was. That former Anna was like a ghost to her now, alien, beautiful, and unattainable. But this dream was not just a reflection, it was a message. In her dream, Anna saw how a wave rolled onto the shore and did not recede. It stayed, covering the sand, and at that moment she understood they too must get out. They could not remain here, under the wreckage, remembering the sea. They had to return to it, to that feeling of freedom. When Anna woke up, the cellar was quiet. She felt that her clothes were damp not only from the humidity, but also from tears. She looked at Misha. He was sleeping, pressed against her. On his wall, in the light of the dim flashlight, she saw a new, unfinished drawing. It was a ship, not a military one, but a large, white passenger liner, sailing on a wide, calm wave. It was sailing from there, the black corner, to there, the bright exit. In that moment, on the 60th day in the cellar, Anna made a decision. They must go, risk their lives to find the opportunity to see the sea in reality and not just in a terror-soaked dream. The cellar, which had been their salvation, had become their prison. It was time to open the door and step into a new, unknown world. The silence they fear. The 61st day arrived, and with it came the thing they had waited for 2 long months, but which they now feared the most: silence. In the morning, after a rare but heavy night shelling that seemed destined to tear apart the remains of the city, the sounds of war died down. At first it was almost imperceptible. Just an extra minute passed without a roar. Then 5 minutes, 10, a whole hour. This silence was unnatural, dense, and ominous. It pressed on the eardrums harder than the roar of shells. In the cellar, people didn't speak. They listened. Their hearing, sharpened by weeks of shelling, could not believe the absence of the habitual background. They felt it was a trap, that an invisible threat lurked somewhere nearby, waiting for them to lose their guard. Petro Semyonovich, pressing his ear to the cold concrete, shook his head. Too quiet. It's not a lull. It's either they're gone or they're very close. Igor, who lived in the cellar with his wife Katya and the baby, broke the silence. If it's the corridor we heard about on the radio, we must try. How much longer can we last? A day? 2? All eyes turned to Anya. After the loudest day and her dream of the sea, she had become the unspoken leader. She looked at Misha, at his small, emaciated fingers instinctively searching for her hand. She looked at Nina Pavlovna, who now looked like a ghost, and at the infant, who urgently needed fresh air. Anya understood that their time was up. There was enough food for 1 day, water for half a day. Leaving was not a choice, but an inevitability. "We are going," Anya said, and her voice sounded firm, but she felt she had made the most terrible decision of her life. "We have waited for this for 2 months. We cannot die here knowing there might be a way out." She instructed them to prepare for the exit. This was the second great ritual of the cellar. Everything they could take, they had to fit into one backpack or bag. No extra items. Only water, leftover food, warm clothes, documents. Petro went to his gallery. His drawings depicting dark houses and a black sea were now covered with a layer of cement dust. He picked up the piece of charcoal he had used to draw, and before putting it in his pocket, he drew one final symbol. It was an arrow pointing to the location of the entrance. This drawing was a farewell to their prison and a testament to their resilience. The cellar community, which had been a single entity for 2 months, now had to disband in order to save themselves. They decided to go in small groups with short intervals so as not to attract attention, and so that in case of shelling, they wouldn't all die together. Petro Semyonovich and Igor began cautiously, inch by inch, to clear the blocked passage. Every tiny crack in the debris was a window into unknown horror. When they finally moved the last beam, light penetrated the cellar. It was not a dim, peaceful light, but a sharp, blinding beam, mixed with the smell of smoke, dust, and something else, the smell of death. This light, which should have been salvation, was terrifying. It exposed all the dirt, horror, and exhaustion of their bodies. Anya took Misha's hand. Petro Semyonovich picked up his backpack. They slowly, one by one, began the ascent. "See you by the sea," Anya whispered to Katya. It was their shared, now almost sacred phrase. When Anya crawled out, she saw the sky for the first time in 2 months. It was not blue. It was gray, low, dirty with smoke, but it was open. Before her lay a city that was not there, through the labyrinth of destruction. The exit from the cellar became not a liberation, but a step into a new nightmare. The world Anna saw was not just destroyed, it was eviscerated. Their 16-story building stood, but its windows were black, knocked out holes, and the facade was covered in shrapnel scars, like pockmarks. The street they used to walk on to go to work and buy groceries had turned into a labyrinth of concrete, metal, and glass. They walked quietly, pressed against the walls. Anna led Misha, who tightly held her hand, and Petro Semyonovich walked behind, as if guarding their rear. The main rule was, don't look down, don't stop, move like a shadow. The city seemed like a necropolis. Not a single sound, except for the crunch of their shoes on broken glass and a distant faint hum that could have been either wind or military machinery. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of smoke, dust, and something else sweetish and unbearable that spoke of lives left behind. Every step was an act of will. They couldn't walk in the center of the streets where the ground was riddled with craters. They crept through courtyards, through holes and fences, past burned-out cars whose frames resembled the skeletons of giant insects. The most terrifying thing was the sense of presence. They knew they could be watched, from dark windows, from under the rubble, from around the corner. Petro Semyonovich, whose skills as an engineer and old city resident proved invaluable, became their navigator. He knew the shortcuts, the detour paths. "This way, Anya, through the arch. There was always an entrance to the other side here. Just faster," he whispered, pointing to a narrow passage between 2 leaning walls. They walked past a playground. The bright, peaceful swings and slide were warped, and the sandbox was covered with chunks of concrete. On the swings, bent and useless, only the shadow of their former lives swung. Misha did not cry, but his eyes, having seen this, became even older. Their path led past a department store where Anna used to buy Misha toys. Now it was a skeleton of a building, with torn advertising posters hanging from it like rags of skin. These posters, shouting about discounts and happy life, looked like a mockery of reality. Anna felt her clothes grow heavy with fear. They spent a whole hour crossing one block because they had to crawl under a pile of beams. At one point, as they lay pressed to the ground, Misha quietly whispered, "Mama, it smells like the cellar here. Only there's more sky." He was speaking of how even with the open sky overhead, the atmosphere was the same, suffocating and deadly. When they finally reached the city's outskirts, where the asphalt became relatively clear, Anna turned around. Behind them lay a ghost city. The city they loved was now a monument to pain and resilience. They saw others, sparse, lonely shadows, also moving in the same direction, towards the invisible corridor they had heard about on the radio. With a feeling of searing relief, they walked past the line where ruins gave way to scorched fields. They were wounded, tired, stained, but they had made it out. Ahead was emptiness, and somewhere far away, on the horizon, Anna saw something that made her gasp. It was not shelling. It was a line that separated them from the unknown. A checkpoint burned the last crumbs of their strength, but it also gave them a purpose. Now, as they walked along the broken but open road, their movements became mechanical. They were no longer hiding. They were marching toward an invisible threshold of freedom. Anna, feeling the weight of every step, focused on Misha. She saw him fighting fear and exhaustion. His head was down, but he stubbornly kept walking. As they passed the place that used to be their courtyard, now just a pile of debris, Misha stopped. He let go of Anna's hand, an unheard of boldness, and bent down to the ground. Anna tensed, ready to grab him at any second, but he was just rummaging among the rubble. Finally, he straightened up. In his small, dust-covered hand lay a gray, flat stone. Not beautiful, not smooth, but an ordinary, unremarkable piece of granite that might have lain there for centuries. "Mama," he whispered, "this is from our courtyard. I'm taking it, to remember." He didn't take a toy. He didn't take a piece of porcelain from his favorite cup. He took a stone, unbreakable, solid. The stone became a symbol of everything they left behind: the land, the memory, the home that had turned to dust. He put it in his jacket pocket, and this tiny weight, it seemed, gave him internal strength. Their road was filled with other shadows, similarly exhausted, silent people emerging from other shelters. They kept their distance from each other, but in their movements a common understanding was evident. They were all creatures of the cellar, burst forth onto the surface. Anna noticed the young couple with the baby, Katya and Igor. They walked 50 meters ahead. Igor carried the child, and Katya supported Nina Pavlovna. Their small community, separated for safety, still moved as a single organism. The farther they got from the ruins, the clearer it became that a new, unknown danger awaited them. On the horizon, where the road curved, silhouettes appeared. They were not the peaceful silhouettes of trees or telegraph poles. When they came closer, everyone slowed down. It was a checkpoint. Dirty, bristling with sandbags and barbed wire, it resembled a mouth ready to snap shut. Behind the bags stood people, in military uniform, armed. Anna's heart shrank to the size of the stone in Misha's pocket. This was the point of no return. They could pass and find a phantom hope, or they could be stopped, and then all their suffering underground would be in vain. Petro Semyonovich, who was walking ahead, turned back to Anna. There was no fear in his eyes, only the weariness of a veteran who knows that the last battle is often the most difficult. "Walk quietly, Anna. Documents in hand. Look only forward. "We are going to our own," he said, although none of them knew exactly who stood behind those bags. She nodded. She held Misha's hand even tighter. The stone in his pocket felt warm. It was her anchor. They approached the checkpoint. The mud on the road, the smell of fuel oil, and the tired, suspicious eyes of the sentry who raised his hand ordering them to stop. Crossing this line was more important than the exit from the cellar itself. It was the moment when the concrete silence was replaced by the uneasy reality.
The checkpoint and the tired eyes. Before them loomed the checkpoint, a crude, clumsy symbol of power and danger. Behind the sandbags and barbed wire stood armed men whose faces were concealed by shadow and exhaustion. They were cold and impassive, and Anna understood that their lives now depended on their fleeting decision. They stopped, raising their hands and holding their documents. The tension was so thick it could be cut. Misha, pressed against his mother, squeezed the stone in his pocket. One of the soldiers, young but with incredibly old eyes, approached them. His voice was sharp and indifferent, as if he were speaking to a pile of garbage, not people. "Documents. Where are you going? Where from?" Petro Semenovich, gathering his last strength, answered clearly and quietly, stating their address on Metallurgith Avenue and the duration of their stay in the cellar. The soldier scrutinized them, dirty, exhausted, with traces of cement dust in their hair. He studied Anna's and Petro Semenovich's passports for a long time, as if looking for a trick. It was a game of endurance. Any tremor, any wrong word could end their journey here. Then the soldier shifted his gaze to Misha. "What's in the pocket?" he asked, and the question sounded like a shot. Misha flinched. Anna opened her mouth to answer, but Petro Semenovich beat her to it. "A stone, a piece of our home. He wants to remember," the old man said, and there was something so sincere and hopeless in his voice that the soldier hesitated. He lowered his hand. He didn't look at the stone, didn't check the backpacks. He just wearily waved them through. "Go on, quickly." It was not permission, but a sentence. They walked through. Immediately after the checkpoint, the road changed. It was broken, but along the roadside stood people in civilian clothes, volunteers. There were few of them, but they looked like angels descended from heaven, in bright vests that sharply contrasted with the gray of the war. One of them, a tall man with a beard and warm eyes, ran up to them. "Water! Here! Are you from the center? Hurry, get on the bus, it's not here for long." Anna took the bottle of water. The water was clean, cool. It was sweet, sweeter than any drink she had ever tasted. Misha drank greedily, and his face, for the first time in 2 months, began to regain a living color. They saw their other neighbors. Katya and Igor were already sitting in an old yellow school bus. Nina Pavlovna sat by the window, crying, clutching her violet which had survived after all. As they boarded the bus, Anna felt the concrete fear finally receding. The volunteer helped them, and his hand was warm and firm, a touch of goodness that was not stained by the war. The bus started moving. It drove slowly, bypassing craters. Anna turned around. The last thing she saw was the destroyed Mariupol disappearing into the haze. Petro Semenovich, sitting next to her, closed his eyes for the first time since the war began and quietly fell asleep. It was a sleep without fear, the first in 2 months. Anna looked at Misha. He took the stone out of his pocket and placed it on the seat. "Mama, when I sleep, it will guard so I don't forget where we came from," he whispered, and his eyelids immediately closed. They were safe. They didn't know where they were going, didn't know what awaited them, but they were on the road, and that was the most important thing. The long, broken path led them toward the light, and this light
was ahead, not behind. The first sunny morning. The ride in the bus was long, bumpy, and silent, but it was a silence of relief, not fear. The bus, full of shadows who had escaped the earth, drove away from the roar, heading north toward Zaporizhia. They arrived in the morning, on the 63rd day of their journey. When the bus stopped and the doors opened, Anna was overwhelmed not by noise or chaos. She was overwhelmed by the air. The air was clean. It didn't smell of smoke, damp, or soot. It smelled of spring, road dust, and a little freshly baked bread. She inhaled deeply, and it was the first breath that didn't burn her lungs in 2 months. They stepped out onto an area that looked like a large volunteer center, tents, tables, busy but kind faces. It was bright here. The light was not the dim beam of a flashlight, but the real, wide, clean light of early morning that flooded the world. The most powerful shock was the first sunny morning. The sun, still low on the horizon, broke through the sparse clouds, and its rays fell upon them. Anna raised her hand to her face and felt the warmth touch her skin. It was a sensation so long forgotten that she nearly wept. Misha, whom she gently woke up, stood staring at the sky. "Mama, the sky, it's blue," he whispered. In the cellar, the sky had only been a grim, blocked-up crack, and in the ruined city, gray with smoke. Here, it was incredibly, strikingly blue, and it was proof that a world beyond their horror still existed. The volunteers worked smoothly and quietly. They gave out food, hot, slightly sweet tea, and real, warm, soft bread. Anna took a piece and handed it to Misha. He didn't eat it right away. He pressed it to his nose, inhaling the scent of peaceful life. "Chew slowly," Anna said, but her own voice trembled with emotion. Petro Semenovich sat nearby. A volunteer gave him a blanket and hot coffee, real, aromatic, with no trace of the cellar conflict. The old man sat wrapped up and drank, watching the hustle and bustle. A shadow of peacefulness appeared on his face for the first time in a long while. They saw Igor, Katya, and Nina Pavlovna. They were also eating. Their faces, washed and clean of cellar dust, looked tired but alive. Nina Pavlovna was carefully watering her violet, which had absorbed all the dirt of the war but still remained green. Anna felt the concrete shell sloughing off of her. She realized that for 2 months they had spent every moment holding their breath, straining every muscle just to survive. Now, in this bright, clean place, she could finally relax. But it was a strange feeling. Guilt. How could she sit here in the warmth when the city they had left behind was still groaning? Anna did not sleep that day. She sat on a bench under the clean blue sky and watched Misha finally smile. He found other children. He wasn't playing with them. He was just standing and watching them play. He was watching their lightness, their safety. It was the first sunny morning of their new life. It did not erase the horror, but it gave them the strength to carry it forward. The calendar that ended, a few days passed. Anna's family settled temporarily in a small, clean room provided by the volunteer center. The warmth, the dry bed, and regular meals restored their physical strength, but could not chase away the shadows from their minds. They were saved, but their life was rebooted. They had lost everything material, but they had gained something more important, the confirmation of their resilience. Misha, who now slept a lot, spent quiet hours taking the stone out of his pocket. He placed it on the windowsill, where the stone warmed in the real sunlight. It was his artifact, his unspoken, unbreakable witness to what they had endured. Every time Anna looked at the stone, she remembered the smell of damp, the darkness, and her son's quiet determination. She knew that their calendar of hash marks on the cellar wall had ended. That calendar was the calendar of survival. Now a blank, clean page lay before them, a calendar of life. Anna often talked with Petro Semenovich. He had become more silent, but more observant. "We are like a sprout now, Anya," he said one day, looking at the sky. "We don't have a big root, but we sprouted through the concrete. We need a new place to become a tree." He was not talking about returning to the destroyed Mariupol. He was talking about a future that needed to be built anew, without walls and cellars. They preserved the warmth of the blanket, which gave them strength in the cold. They preserved the aroma of coffee and the prayer on the old crate, which reminded them of mercy and sacrifice. And they preserved the blue sky, a symbol of freedom that was stolen but then returned. One evening before bed, Misha came up to Anna. He was holding his stone, but this time he did not place it on the windowsill. "Mama," he said, "I won't think about it anymore until we go back. I want to think about the sea now." He did not want the stone, a symbol of the difficult days, to stand between him and his new sleep. Anna tucked him into the clean, dry bed. She hugged him. "Sleep, Misha. You've earned a long, warm sleep." She went outside. The night was quiet, full of stars. Here, far from the front line, the stars seemed closer and brighter than the ones Misha had once seen through his telescope. This was the world. She understood that the scars would remain forever. The sound of a loud thud would always cause a spasm in her. The smell of dampness would remind her of the darkness. But they got out. They survived. The story of the cellar calendar ended not with a triumph, but with a quiet, well-deserved hope. They did not know when they would see their sea again, but they knew they would live for that day. She looked at the stars. Her path had been long and terrifying, but the main rule she had given her son on that last day of light had come true. They would return. They would return when they could see the sea that would be peaceful, clean, and blue like the sky above them now. And for now, they needed to sleep and to wait.